Hi everyone. All right, I just kind of summarized the complex numbers notes that we had. In the introduction to this concept, and we started out just with this standard equation, x squared plus 1 equals 0. If we subtract 1 from both sides, we got x squared equals negative 1. And then if we take the square root of both sides, we got x equals the square root of negative 1. And it would actually be a positive or negative square root. But we've never been able to define that. Not in the real number, and we still can't in the real number system. So we're going to expand and go to complex numbers to do that. And we actually define the number I as equaling the square root of negative 1. And I is called the imaginary unit. And in addition to I equaling square root of negative 1, that's just an identity you need to memorize. I squared is equal to negative 1 as well. I squared equals negative 1. So the answer to this equation is x equals positive or negative I. And it does have this value, and here's how it's defined. Now, we do have a standard form for complex numbers, and it would be A plus BI. A is the real part of the complex number. B, which is also a real number. This number B is actually a real number, but it's being multiplied by I, so it's called the imaginary part of the real number. And just some examples, just for simplifying. If I want to simplify and write in standard form, that's my directions for these examples we're going to do. My first example, let's do that for negative 4 minus the square root of negative 36. Well, now the square root of negative 36, when we have to simplify that, let's immediately factor out the negative 1. And if you'll recall, when we have the square root of a product, we can just take the square root of each part. So that is equal to the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 36. And the square root of negative 1 is I. So this is I. And the square root of 36 is 6. So this is 6I. This part's right here is 6I. So I'm going to rewrite this as negative 4 minus 6I. So there's number 1. Number 2. The example I will do is 5 minus the square root of negative 75. And I do want to deal with the square root of negative 75 over here a little bit. I'm going to rewrite it as negative 1, and then I know 25 is a factor, so 25 times 3 is how I'll split up the 75. And that's the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25 times the square root of 3. Square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 25 is 5, and then you have the square root of 3 cannot be simplified anymore. So we can write that as 5I radical 3. Another way I'll talk about here in a second. I'll accept this as standard form, but if we're talking about the imaginary part, it's 5 radical 3 is the imaginary part, and then you get your I here. So this might be a little better of a way, but either way is good because of the radical and the I there. we can go either direction there. Now, the third example I have is the square root of negative 128. And I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to go negative 1. I know that 64 times 2, so I'm going to use 64 as a factor when I factor this. Negative 1 times 64 times 2, so that's square root of negative 1 times the square root of 64 times the square root of 2. Square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 64 is 8. And then the square root of 2 can't be simplified anymore. So I'm going to write this as 8I radical 2. And if I want standard form, and I'm going to write this as 8 radical 2I, because here's my imaginary part is 8 radical 2. My real part, I don't have anything here. I won't change the value by putting a 0 there, so my real part is 0. Now, this term, when 0 is the real part, then you got 8 radical 2I, or something else like that, this is called completely imaginary. This is a real number that is completely imaginary. Now, on my fourth example, I just have the number 57. If I need standard form for complex numbers, I need an imaginary part. Well, I don't want to change the value, but if I go 0 times I don't. So that's standard form, and that's having the imaginary part here also. This is called completely real. All right. And I think I'll just do one more for the good of the order. Negative 10I plus 5I squared. Now, that's negative 10I plus, I have I squared up here is equaling negative 1. We decided that early on. So I'm going to replace, anytime I have I squared, I'm replacing it with negative 1. So I've got negative 10I, and 5 times negative 1 is negative 5. But if I'm going to keep it in order, I'm going to put the real part first and the imaginary part second. All right, there you go. That's our introduction to complex numbers.